And last up, we have Andrea Giovannetti from ACU.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much. My name is Andrea Giovannetti. It's a great delight to be here. I'm an assistant professor at Australian Catholic University, and I'm co-director at the at the Tackling Hate Laboratory at Deakin University, where we do things that are quite different from what I'm going to present today. Today, I'm going to present elements of a theoretical/operative framework that we began developing in 2020, along as with some results that we come through in these years. And this framework was developed because we were trying to understand the behavior of organized crime groups in a specific area of UK, Merseyside. Along the time, we produced a set of papers. Today, I'm going to mix and match specifically from 3 of these works. One has already been published. The third one is a contribution in criminology. And then we have a microeconomic model, paper number 2. And the first paper is more a contribution in standard applied economic work. All the works here are available for download. And if you find interest in what we are going to discuss, what I'm going to discuss today, please get in touch, because we think it would be great to open a space here in Australia on this type of literature. So what are the motivating questions behind my presentation today? Just a bit of background. Back in 2020, with Paolo Campana in Cambridge, we decided to revisit a very typical classic theme of urban criminology, specifically in urban disorganization theory, that is the relationship between violence and drug markets in urban environments. Now, if you are familiar with this type of literature, you know that it went through several waves, at least 3 waves. Starting from the mid-'85, researchers got hands on very large cross-sectional data set, including counts of crime for various categories, plus some features of cities, and they start looking at which type of crimes correlate together. And a classic result that holds all over the developed world in major cities is that episodes of violence normally cluster heavily with drug markets, which are normally stable. And these are not evenly distributed in cities. What you normally see in data, at least in this initial literature, is that the clustering is specific to certain micro area of cities. This was obviously very important from an operative perspective, because thanks to the work of people like Larry Sherman, he pioneered the idea that cities are populated by hotspots. And this was operatively important because it gave rise to the notion of hotspot policy, which is still a paradigm in many cities in the world. With better data becoming available from the mid-'90s to the 2005, 2006, many researchers tried to look at the correlates of violence in the areas surrounding drug markets. And thanks to crime agencies, typical results of this period is showing that violence is obviously non-random, particularly looking at the features. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think it's better. Looking at the features of offenders, it turns out, using traditional techniques from nectar theory, that many individuals involved in acts of violence in the surrounding of stable drug markets are associated to essentially organized crime. Now, fast forward, around 2008, 2010, a series of results, specifically from US, major city here is Seattle, show that with the introduction of better methods, causal methods, and most importantly, with a shift from cross-sectional data into time series and panel data, a correlation that looked very strong, drug with violence, is actually not necessarily that strong. In fact, there's many drug markets that are actually peaceful, or even more embarrassing, the situations where the correlation goes the other way around. That is, if you see more violence, you're also more likely to see less drug dealing. Depending on the area, depending on the time, everything can be. This means that of course, there's a correlation, there's a relationship between these two variables, but probably there's many things in between. So many moving parts at play in between. This was our starting point. And like many others, we had an idea that, of course, organized crime play a role between these two type classes of crimes. So we are definitely not the first ones that try to address the relationship of violence and drug markets on territories, thinking about organized crime groups. But differently from other works, we are not looking at the features of one specific group or other specific groups, narratives describing specific groups of agents. We take a step back, and rather than looking at the micro level, we look at the meso level. So we start looking at how the changes in the structure of connections of a relationship across gangs may have implications on both classes of crime. Okay? Then things actually escalated along the years. We tried to generalize this setting. We started to think on the causal factors of gangs' behavior, and we come up with a more elaborate theory, which we call a theory of competition and cooperation. I will introduce a few elements of that later. But first, we are not in UK, and I'd like to describe a bit the laboratory where we mostly work for in these 5 years. Merseyside is the most populated metropolitan county of UK, with Liverpool being the main city. In terms of population density and spread, you can think of, we are in Sydney here, so you can think of the area that goes from the northern beaches down to Cronulla. Similar area, similar density. However, it's very different from the classic countryside UK you would expect. It features the highest number of organized crime groups per million, twice as high as to the national average, and 1/4 more groups than the area of Greater London. Myself, working with Metropolitan London Police in the last 3-4 years, I can confirm that the type of crime orbit that we see for groups in Liverpool is very different from what you have in London, where the main problem is pure effects. Liverpool is an entire different thing. You may know that, I need to go back, sorry. You may know that here we have Ireland, which is very important for the macro social situation in Merseyside. And Liverpool, the main city, has one major harbour system. Why is Ireland important? Because since the 70s, Liverpoolians began buying firearms from PIRA movement. So there's a high availability of firearms in Liverpool. And just to give you an idea, in the 3 years and a half of our observations, we witnessed more than 70 OCG-related homicides. But then you also have kidnappings, arson, very high level of violence in various areas of the city. So it's a very rich context. The harbor system is also important because, of course, drugs arrive through 2 main routes. We have the Balkan routes from Iran and Turkey, progressing into Liverpool. And then you also have cocaine from Netherlands. In terms of ethnographies of gangs, it's known that groups from outside Liverpool do not stick their nose in the Merseyside areas. But on the other hand, we do have many county sides, so we have supply chains that depart from Liverpool, go down to Manchester, London, and then back up to Cambridge and Peterborough. So it's a very well-connected area, and flows are unidirectional from Liverpool to the rest of the UK. Now, our work here is about organized crime groups. How do we understand organized crime groups in this work? The building bricks of our analysis is given by crime reports and intelligence report from the police. Differently from other work, we are not reconstructing organized crime groups. We actually obtain this information from the police forces. From crime records, we managed to characterize the behavior of individual offenders, and from individual offenders, we reconstruct the behavior of organized crime groups. How does it work? Crime reports are very simple type of data, nothing comparable to things like EncroChat data. Essentially, think about a table. A crime report essentially is a line in the table containing a number, which is the report, some narrative about what happened, the people involved, the location, the time, as well as information
about individuals provided by police intelligence. So we know whether individuals were parts of an organized group, and we also have more information about these groups. Now, all this information is taken, we characterize individuals, and then, importantly for this set of works, we look at co-offending relationships across offenders. So supposing the data you have 6 individuals, what we are after is looking at all accidents or incidents where an individual cooperated, so co-offended with other individuals. And since we know whether those individuals belong to organized crime groups, we can also essentially work at a higher level, reconstruct the behavior of organized crime groups. Organized crime groups in our work are given by the sum of actions of their members, okay? Meaning that we go through a rather large data reduction. We start big from 376,000 crime reports, committed by around 63,000 actors, and then we zoom in the behavior of 1,200 organized crime group members. Of course, we don't lose track of this thing. The crime reports are used to characterize what happens in the city, but we are interested mostly in the action of the organized crime group members. So again, we start large from all the crimes, then we move to organized crime group members, and from members, we look at the behavior of gangs, okay? I'm coming back to this slide shortly later. Now, before I introduce some elements of the theory and some results, I think it makes sense to discuss a bit the features of Merseyside, because again, it's a very interesting laboratory. We are tremendously grateful to the police for the generosity of their interaction. It has been always essentially a two-way research mission, because they gave us ideas, and they were also very keen in listening to us when it comes to their operations. Performing a simple, typical 80s correlation exercise, it's easy to see that drugs and violence correlate strongly, and drug markets are normally very stable. There's many intuitive ways to see that drug dealing takes place in specific areas of the cities, so we have hotspots, and there is a lot of violence gravitating around these areas. What is more interesting is that when you put things in motion, so you perform an exercise which is similar to what you had in papers since the 2010 onwards, yes, in aggregate, you still see strong correlations. You can make the argument precise, for example, with the DCC-GARC model. But once you move into zoom into the behavior of organized crime groups, you will see that these correlations fall apart. Indeed, I mean, you can see from the graph already that maybe it's not that it's not correlated, it's not, but the thing is they are not simultaneous, okay? That's why correlations look like falling apart. So it's interesting because it matches the experience we had in other parts of the world. I'm thinking of Seattle, the results from Cynthia Lam, but many other places, actually. So keep this on a side, and let's see other interesting features that we can use, and that we can try to explain with our theory. Here I'm zooming on the behavior of organized crime groups. I'm looking on how gangs behave on territories. And primarily, I'm an economist by background. The first thing I wanted to understand is what is the market where these gangs are operating. And there's many intuitive way to verify that these areas, the markets, are highly contendable. That is, it's very easy to see gangs spreading on the territory. That is, it's very hard for an organized crime group to avoid other groups to enter in their own territory. So on this, the situation is very different from what we have in other contexts. For example, in Naples, in Rome, in Mannheim, in Berlin. It's a different scenario. Many intuitive ways to show that. For example, suppose you can look at all territories and all gangs. Then you're gonna look for each gang. You see on how many territories a gang is the most important prominent group. Call these people the leading organized crime group. Then for the same area, you can look at whether there is a gang lower in the rank, okay? And we call these followers. Now, easy to see that even in a context, in a static context, in Merseyside, you can see here, there's many gangs that are leading in many areas, but at the same time, these very same gangs are also followers in other areas. So this is very different from what you would expect from a consolidated market, where essentially gangs either lead in their territories or not, or they may exist elsewhere, but they would not stick their nose in other parts of the city. So areas are contendable, and this also was confirmed by the police, and they're also actively contended. I'm going to show you what happens when we set things in motion, but this is already something you can see in a static setting like this. That is, if you randomly pick a group in Merseyside, you can easily see that it's more likely that that group is leading on that area rather than following. Okay, so in other words, yeah, sure, gangs are spread out, but it's easier that gangs operate in territories where they have predominance. Once again, I want to emphasize that this information do not simply come from crime reports. We do have intelligence information from the police. Now, let me put things in motion. We're waiting for a clearance to produce an event study about police operations, but I think it's already, to give you an intuition, the amount of pressure that there is in this location, one single operation is already enough. Just a little bit of background. In 2015, there had been a spate of homicides in the area controlled by two organized crime groups. Homicides is the red line here. This is essentially a timeline from July 2015 till July 2018. So, in spite of homicides, many innocents involved in the attempt homicides, and one kid got killed with a firearm. So the police decided to heavily monitor the area of actions of a group of gangs. And after several months, they decided to perform an extraction. Around 25 people had been arrested. These two groups had been dismantled. The problem is, this was public information. As the gangs had been removed from the setting, in the 1 quarter after the arrest, the number of organized crime groups operating in those areas actually went up. And at the same time, for 2 quarters following the arrest, the amount of violence, which is this line in blue, also went up. Drug dealing remained pretty much constant. And as you can see, if you compare the entire series, it looks like the police actually had a destabilizing effect. That is, by targeting 2 single groups, essentially not looking at the entire structure, the mesostructure of all the groups that operated in Merseyside, they didn't realize that the operation had a destabilizing effect. We had a spate of attempt murders and murders. Till the late 2017, when the number of organized crime groups in the area dropped, and also violence was reduced, and also homicides at some point stabilized. So as you can see, there's high pressure. It looks like gangs do not leave spaces empty. If there's an opportunity, they're going to seek it quickly. One last thing, which I think is interesting. If we go back and look at the structure of cooperation of organized crime groups, a very interesting picture emerges. And it's interesting because it matches the experience of other places all over the world. We had evidence from Toronto, Vancouver, Boston, that the structure of co-funding relationship across groups is highly asymmetric. What you normally see is a small number of very complex, large groups that run scale-up operations, and then these large groups are normally surrounded by a myriad of small idiosyncratic groups that perform bursts of actions, then they become silent for a while, and then they reappear in your data set, performing very specialized operations. At the same time, the number of co-funding relationships that you see between major groups is normally very limited. So it looks like big groups try not to engage with each other. They prefer to work with smaller, or as we call them, buffer groups. So definitely an interesting setting, very different from, at least my experience with larger cities. I'm thinking about London primarily, but we also have data from Tokyo and Nagoya. Organized crime there is very different from what we see in the Liverpool area. Liverpool, in a way, in a recent assessment with the Home Office, where we were asked to find comparison groups, probably the closest thing we have is Naples between the 80s and the 90s, or Rome in the 90s, but definitely nothing like that in the rest of UK. An interesting setting and many interesting operative questions. For example, why do organized crime groups cooperate to begin with? How do they choose their partners? What type of activities do they coordinate on, and why? Our starting point in this type of framework is that organized crime groups look like being very rational. They react to incentives, and normally, I think that I don't have time to discuss here, unless we work on it later, is that they favor business over violence. And once you test their behavior on a model where individuals essentially face a trade-off between revenue on dealing drugs against the risk of finding those areas occupied by other groups, well, it looks like the model is able to predict the distribution of organized crime groups in the city pretty well compared to what we see in the data. So they're rational, they react to incentives, they don't miss opportunities. And then, if all of this is true, it's clear that we can start thinking of cooperation between organized crime groups as a mechanism to moderate competition, right? These are contendable markets. It means that there's lots of pressure. Pressure in illicit markets means violence. Markets and violence is not good for the business. So if you think about cooperation as a mechanism that organized crime groups use to remove themselves from this competitive environment, then many things start making sense. Because you would expect that changes in the cooperation between organized crime groups has to have an impact on both the violence, that is the level of competition, but also the amount of business, that is drug dealing, right? You can apply this type of framework on other problems. For example, how do organized crime groups choose their partners in such complicated environment? Well, this is a scenario where you can't write contracts because it's illicit markets. So it's clear that organized crime groups are going to be strategic in the partner selections. And what we find, we have evidence that gangs select partners to minimize the risk of future conflict, because there's perverse incentive to cooperation when you are in illicit markets. I give you an example. Suppose that two gangs come together, they have a deal, the deal is successful. So there's profit to share. These are illicit markets. It can be that one party gets away with the money, or, which is a even more problematic situation, those extra resources that had been unlocked by the cooperation could be used by the group to displace the former partner in future interaction. So it must be that this also enters in the framework. Same thing can be applied to study, for example, what type of crime gangs are more likely to cooperate on, which I have it in my appendix. Let's just me focus a bit on this idea that cooperation has an impact on territories as a mechanism to moderate competition. Okay, very simple way many possible ways to test it. I'll just give you an intuition. We can build a cooperation index, which is area-based. So every area of the city, we construct a cooperation index that changes along time. The idea is looking at how many cooperative relationship we observe, so how many gangs are cooperating against the potential number of gangs that could cooperate in that area. Well, how do we know that? Because we know in each area how many gangs are active, and we know across the city how many of those gangs are cooperating elsewhere. So this allows us to construct a dynamic indicator of cooperation. And interestingly enough, this cooperation index changes dramatically, both in time, but also depending on the locations where, depending on the location. The first result we get is cooperation index statistically interesting because it allows us to predict 1 month ahead changes to violence and drug dealing. If the cooperation index goes up by 1%, say, this is associated with a 1.4 increment in the monthly level of drug dealing for the month ahead and 1.5 reduction of serious violence in the neighborhood. Interesting, if you try to correlate, violence against drug dealing, the relationship is obviously very poor, as we've seen in the picture. So cooperation matters and can help us understanding jointly these two dimensions. Probably it's useful as a mediating factor to explain violence and drug dealing on territories. We control for fixed effects, so anything time invariant is accounted for, and we also have time trends in the model. We test this model using several possible type of discount factor for the index. So the index is allowed to grow, but it can also drop if relationships are not reestablished across groups. The second thing I wanted to touch, who collaborates with whom? I mentioned that in a competitive setting where you can't write contracts to protect yourself against the future behavior of your partners, gangs are going to be strategic. And we tested several models. The idea that looked like more reasonable, also in terms of predicting power, was that apparently the control of area is something that matters for gangs, and which makes sense if you're a small gang. Of course, you may find useful to collaborate with bigger gangs because they give you access to resources, markets, technology. But at the same time, larger groups prefer to deal with smaller gangs. I have just a figure here. What we do, for every area and every gang, we construct a thing we call divergence index. The divergence index measures the territorial control for each territory, for each gangs, net of the influence of other groups. And what we find is a 10% increase in the divergence index between two gangs operating in the same territory is associated with a 13% increase in the probability of having at least one cooperation between these two organized crime groups. So again, gangs are not working in a vacuum, and we do have evidence that behavior is at least partially coordinated across groups. This is important because it means that targeting organized crime groups requires a broader set of actions and probably a broader perspective that what we would think, what we would apply for other types of crime. That's all on my side. The last thing I wanted to say, which is something that by presenting this work to police forces received some attention, is the following take-home message, that is, tranquil is not necessarily okay. This is the main take-home message from our work so far. Tranquil is actually a defeat because it means that organized crime groups were able to coordinate and ensure stability in some area, and stability means that resources are unlocked, they're accumulated, and they can be used for future deeds. So, and this is important because, of course, if you measure the success of a police operation in terms of the amount of violence you see in territories or drugs, not having this information doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It probably means that groups are just are good in accumulating. I think I'm done. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. We do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So is there any questions on the floor? At all? Yes.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
I was interested in those trends that you had where you looked at the impact of the arrests on the not only the crime rates, but the amount of organised crime groups.
This one?
Yeah. So what happened after the sentenced outcome and you started to see that drop off? What do you think is going on there?
What I can tell is that in our understanding, one group managed to establish a weak control of these areas, and this is consistent with with at least two measures. First, you can see that the number of uniquely identified organized crime groups drops. So they manage to secure and control the area, and at the same time also violence drops. Homicides follow a similar trend. So homicides is reduced. So it looks like everything is tranquil and fine, but it's not, because we know that.
So it is stabilized after.
Exactly, this is the key word. Yeah. We have a set of results using microeconomic models showing that police intensity in specific hotspot can actually alter the equilibrium structure of dealing all over the city. And this is not necessarily good news, because we can show that gangs become more keen in going into area where profits is limited, but there's also less frictions with other gangs. So they become more interested in exploring the city, if you like. And this is a problem because a tranquil area means it's an area where the gang can essentially thrive, make business without conflict from other groups. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I know you mentioned there's some disparity in the way that organised crime groups cooperate even within Britain itself. How transferable do you think the results are from your findings to the Australian context?
It's a very good question. I work with Home Affairs on different topics, and I didn't have the chance yet to put my hands on Australian data. Looking at international context, I think it's a regularity. That is something I would expect here, like in many other places. We do have very good first-hand data from, you mentioned Vancouver and Toronto, where it's very interesting because if you look at the disparity across groups' cooperations, you see numbers that are very similar to what we get in Merseyside. Now, if we look at the country, we know that Australia and Canada share many, there's many things on which they are similar. And I would expect to see probably the same type of dynamics. It would be great to actually investigate this if it was possible. Also, I didn't discuss about conflicts. We only touched about cooperation. And one main reason is that our data is mostly about co-offending. We don't have offending relationships. I have them for work I'm doing with London. But there's a mirror hypothesis that we could test if we had confrontations across groups. That is, we would expect confrontations to take place, especially between large groups, right? Because this would be the mirror image of the cooperation. I have a picture, but I don't have the supporting evidence here. Just to show you how complex the interactions between organized crime groups can be. This is London. It's in progress. The green is cooperation, the red is fights, and the yellow, which is the most interesting, at the very core of this county line, so it's a drug supply chain. Yellow is situations where you both have conflict and cooperation. So it's a highly dynamic situation. And it's interesting because it's taking place precisely at the very mid of the supply chain. It's in progress, huh? And so, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much,
Thank
Andrea.
you so much.